Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our annual EdTalk. Greetings to our teacher candidates and to our community of instructors, faculty members, and practicum advisors in the Faculty of Education. I'm so pleased that you're all here with us today. My name is Melanie Jansen, and I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Education, and I'm co-hosting this event today with Alundra Elder and Michael Chan from your Student Council. We're so thrilled to be presenting to you our EdTalk guest today, Kira Brandt-Bierkoff. Her talk today will be focused on reconciliation in teacher education, why it still matters in a post-COVID landscape. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the treaties that we're on today. The University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration.
Well, thank you, Melanie. Just a quick background on Kira. Kira Brandt-Bierkoff is a Haudenosaunee educator, academic, and lifelong learner from the Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory in Ontario. Kira is a PhD candidate in the Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy at the University of British Columbia, where she is currently writing her dissertation on theorizing the possibilities of estrangement and homecoming as grounded in Haudenosaunee teachings. Kira has taught in Ontario and British Columbia as an elementary teacher, teacher educator, and professional development facilitator for practicing teachers. Some of her recent projects include facilitating an Indigenous book club for K-12 teachers in Vancouver, identifying cross-curricular connections to the ancestral knowledge of fourth-year NIT EP students at UBC, and conducting research on treaty education in Aotearoa, also known as New Zealand, for her master's thesis. She has published on theorizing reconciliatory pedagogies, reconceptualizing Indigenous teacher education, and using autoethnographic métissage to deconstruct systems of colonialism in higher education. If you have any questions throughout this session, please ask them in the Q&A, and Alundra or myself will ask them on your behalf at the end of the session. Please welcome Ms. Brandt-Bierkoff.
Thank you so much for that, Mike. Melanie, my most heartfelt appreciation for the invitation to join everyone here this afternoon to the EdTalk committee to UM's Faculty of Education. I'll pull up my slideshow and we'll get this going. So the focus of the afternoon talk here today, I thought we could focus on thinking about reconciliation or conciliation, unpacking what it means to move from, I think, a buzzword and a term to something that still holds meaning, particularly on our post-COVID landscape for educators, primarily for my passion of teacher education with our teacher candidates, but more broadly to think about the educational discourse and where we find ourselves in relation to Indigenous education. As Mike said, my name is Kira Brandt-Bierkoff. My Ganyageha name is Gayet Nordo. I'm a Haudenosaunee educator of the Mohawk Nation from Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory. Tyendinaga is my ancestral community. It's where my family is from, and it's where I was born and raised. So I've been away from home for quite a while for school, moving around, but most recently found my way home as I knew I would, just right after Christmas. My husband and I moved back, and so I join you here today from my ancestral community, from my great-grandfather's cabin, actually. He built this, and we call it home now. We made our way out to the West Coast where I started my PhD at UBC. And so the focus of today, I guess I just really want to highlight that it's what I do as a profession is to think about Indigenous education, but it is very much it's my passion. It's who I am. It's what I'm grounded in. The picture here is of little Kira growing some asparagus just up the road at my grandma's house. And what I love about asparagus is it takes a while to get its roots established, but it grows for a lifetime once it's planted. And so to me, me. I am firmly, my roots are grounded here in Tyndonega, but I know that no matter where I go, I have a place to call home. And I hope to share some of this knowledge and some of this teaching with you here today. As we begin today, however, I just want us to ground ourselves first with thinking about the weight of which the time in which we're living in. And I'd like to begin by having a moment of silence to honor those lives lost to COVID-19. I believe it's really easy for us to start to normalize the inconveniences of the impact that COVID-19 has had on our lives. And it's a privilege to be here to speak about Indigenous education and moving forward in a post-COVID landscape. But really, the only thing that matters in this time, I believe, is the lives and the safety of Canadians. And so with this, I'd like to begin with a moment of silence, if you'll join me, to honor the lives lost to COVID-19, to honor the loved ones who are grieving right now, and to honor and to provide strength to all of those, any of us, including those of us here today, who are facing those hardships that seem insurmountable. Thank you so much for joining me in that. So as we begin this afternoon, the focus of my discussion over the next hour or so will first ground us in rethinking about reconciliation. What is reconciliation? How can it be framed? And how can it inform the good work that we do in education? Then also providing some conversation to this discourse of moving to the essentials. And lastly, for us to think about teacher education as a rich site of possibility for a praxis of reconciliation to transpire within. And so let us begin. To frame these conversations of reconciliation, I find it helpful to use Justice Murray Sinclair's words as the most concise way for us to think about reconciliation, here defining it as reconciliation is about forging and maintaining respectful relationships. There are no shortcuts. For myself, I understand reconciliation as a multifaceted, reciprocal, reflexive, continuous, ongoing process. It's responsive to the changing needs in a relationship. Just like a reciprocal relationship between friends and loved ones, it needs to be ever changing. Although it can have significant events and markers, it's not one event or one moment alone. Just like a marriage, you might have a ceremony. Just like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you might begin with an apology, but it cannot be reduced to an event in isolation. It must be a lifetime commitment to growing together. Importantly, reconciliation also prioritizes land. Whereas we most often frame reconciliation as the repatriation of relationships between people, it must also prioritize this building a relationship with land and rebuild our ethical relationships as the first caretakers of this land. Lastly, I also find it integral to highlight the ways in which there are different roles and responsibilities in reconciliatory processes. For Indigenous peoples, we have our own internal healing processes. We are working in moments of healing, of revitalizing our languages after a long sleep. And I find it important for settler people to also understand and to have patience of some of us are eager to jump in and to engage in these rebuilding of relationships with Indigenous peoples, but there's also a significant amount of work that needs to happen in our Indigenous communities as well. And if we try to rush that process, I fear that then it can start a reappropriation of Indigenous knowledge because we haven't allowed Indigenous communities and Indigenous peoples to find our own reconciliatory processes and to heal first. So, of course, thinking about reconciliation, the word is not without criticism and limitation. So why is it that we continue to use the language of reconciliation when it is so contentious. There are many contentious debates around the use of reconciliation, primarily for its religious connotations, its grounding in Catholicism, the sacrament of confession or penance, and also most commonly, one of the biggest criticisms as well is that people say it's impossible to speak of reconciliation if we've never had conciliation. In other words, if there have never been peaceful, harmonious, or mutually beneficial relationships, why are we seeking a return to something that has no precedent? And I believe that these criticisms are necessary, but I also believe that we need to frame these conversations of using the language of reconciliation. So I continue to use the word of reconciliation because I believe if the term is going to be used, then it needs to be defined and used by Indigenous peoples. For example, if we're going to speak of milestones or moving forward from Indigenous settler relationships in terms of reconciliation, then it needs to be Indigenous peoples who are using it, defining it, and controlling how these conversations are being driven. Even if we wish to retire the buzzword and move in favor of something else, it's dangerous if we just have buzzwords that are used too abstractly or are under-theorized. A word is just a word until it's given power, and I choose to give it power by framing it from an Indigenous perspective. I also use it because I believe that there has been a framework for conciliation. There is a framework for reciprocal relationships and paving the way for reciprocity when we return to the treaties. For the Haudenosaunee, for my people, my ancestors, this is our wampum belt Gaswenta, also known as the two-row wampum. And our Gaswenta Treaty exemplifies how my ancestors envisioned ethical and reciprocal relationships between Indigenous and settler peoples in the two-row teachings. So here, the purple bead signifying two canoes going down the same path, but not trying to steer the other. And so when we had these conversations with early settlers and entered into treaty with these early settlers, we developed this framework. And there is precedent for these relationships. And I believe that if we return to these primarily in relationship with the land, with the ancestors and what this vision was, there is that framework and paving the way forward. Of course, so many of these frameworks have been compromised, but that doesn't mean that there's not a vision. So in a move to essentials and thinking about this conversation in light of COVID. So almost a year ago this time, the threat of COVID was slowly becoming a grim reality across the world. Quickly, in an effort of public safety and to reduce the transmission of COVID-19, all provinces and territories began to prioritize the essential sectors of Canadian society, thereby categorizing Canadians' services, amenities as essential or non-essential to public safety, and in turn, as we've also seen, essential or non-essential to the economy. The intent of such categorization was to get to the root of what is necessary in a crisis. Likewise, for K-12 educators, we saw our students off to spring break in March, but few of us saw them again for the remainder of the year as the grip of COVID had taken control of Canadian society by mid-March of 2020. Educators had their first pivot to scramble to prepare to online learning with varying degrees of familiarity and confidence. Parents and teachers alike panicked over students' education in the midst of what was then the first wave of COVID-19. In turn, youth too quickly internalized the anxiety of falling behind in their education. In the early aftermath of the pandemic, a study in May of 2020 was conducted on what concerned Canadian youth the most about COVID-19. They assessed what was the biggest worry for them. So our Canadian youth, ages 10 to 20 who were surveyed, purported that only 15% were worried about contracting the virus, while 22% were worried about their parents contracting the virus. However, the top two worries that students expressed were number one, missing out on school this year, and number two, missing out on school next year. So being 27 and 29% of Canadian youth, respectively. So this concern over students falling behind, educators were then confronted with offering just the basics, recognizing that the students needed just the essentials, just enough to get through the school year to accommodate room for the energies that were being spent elsewhere. Reflecting on the big question, what knowledge is necessary in a crisis? Teachers reduced their curricular priorities to the bare minimum to accommodate the plethora of other challenges, logistic, mental health, and otherwise, that students face when trying to resume their schooling amidst the global pandemic. We did this to protect our students, and certainly to protect ourselves. Our educators are consistently experiencing troubling rates of burnout and mental health like we've never seen before. What this backbone, just the essentials curriculum has revealed, however, is that Indigenous education is one of the first initiatives on the chopping block. Whereas educators are undoubtedly committed to Indigenous perspectives, cultures, and histories in their classrooms, its precariousness is still very palpable. Although Indigenous education is perhaps important to our teachers, what COVID-19 has revealed is that it's not deemed essential. Reflecting on the bigger picture, however, I propose that what we need to reflect on is what is it that our children need now more than ever? What knowledge of our world needs to be prioritized in this generational defining moment? In an attempt to cling to only the essentials in our education system, we've seen Indigenous knowledge fall by the wayside, rendered as a supplemental knowledge to the core curriculum. Again, I don't doubt that our educators are committed to including Indigenous knowledges in their classrooms, but so long as it is treated as an alternative or a supplemental knowledge base, it will continue to be dismissed. It will continue to be the perspectives of, we'll get to them if we have time, which not only ensures the superficial engagement with these complex knowledge systems, but reinforces the inferiority of Indigenous knowledge. In the Anthropocene, the knowledge, teachings, and values of Indigenous education is needed more than ever. Whereas Indigenous knowledge is grounded in its respective socio-cultural contexts, unique to the diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities across Turtle Island, the value of these ancestral knowledge systems are universally premised on reciprocal relationships with the natural world, the physical world, and spirit world. Imagine how simple but powerful it would be for our students to carry a philosophy that they belong in this world and that they are committed to every living being, as is reflected by this commitment to reciprocity with all living things. Amidst the crisis that we face today, namely the COVID-19 pandemic, rising greenhouse gases, or the melting of our polar ice caps, the true crisis that faces this generation is the reality that we are running out of time to acknowledge that inherent responsibilities are not to the individual, but to the collective. I'm often baffled as to why our children are still learning about the pyramids of ancient Egypt when they struggle to recount the history of these lands. I've always found it ironic that we speak of ancient Egypt, but fail to speak to the history of ancient Canada, a phrase I've never heard. To speak of and learn from the history of this land is not only a historical study of an ancestral past, but it deepens our understanding and relationship to place. The land can heal us, but only when we have the knowledge of the ancestral teachings to know this land as it is meant to be understood. When I speak of this relationship to land, I do not mean to speak abstractly, but quite literally. This land provides for us, and in return, we must provide for her. When we deepen our relationship to land, this deepens our relationship to place and all who live here. In turn, we care for our community. To view ourselves not as individuals, but as citizens of the land, we move towards the collective, reinforcing my commitment to others. I'm not certain how studying ancient Egypt, I'm picking on ancient Egypt today, helps our youth to understand these teachings. But I can guarantee you that authentic teachings that are based in ancient Canada can. Knowledge keeper Aruntia Hearn once shared that only once we stop speaking about inherent rights and start speaking about our inherent responsibilities will we then begin to understand how to live righteously. What if justice was not about equality before the law, but our commitment to each other? If we were guided by the pursuit of justice, how quickly would COVID-19 cease its grip on our daily lives and be replaced by our collective responsibility to each other? In this move to essentials, wherein Indigenous knowledge is vital, valued, and validated in our classrooms, all learners can benefit. Cognitive imperialism, as I understand it from Mi'kmaq scholar Marie Batiste, reinforces the superiority of Euro-Western thought in educational discourse. The implications of cognitive imperialism continue to disguise Indigenous knowledge as not much more than just an arts and crafts culture. For example, I often see Indigenous teachings at the forefront of social studies and history lessons with a focus on historical culture and lifestyle, which, yes, are of anthropological value and interest, but it does little to honor the complexities of Indigenous sustainability, cosmology, medicine, philosophical ethics, just to name a few. I want us to center Indigenous knowledge systems in our classrooms so as to offer our students a comprehensive view of the world at a time when we need to reframe our relationship with the natural world in the Anthropocene. And so this brings us to the implications of this in teacher education as a site of possibilities. Working in teacher education, it never fails me to think about the momentous responsibility of preparing new teachers for the even more momentous responsibility to educate our youth. As a lifelong learner myself, I'm constantly rejuvenated by my teacher candidates' eagerness to absorb, question, critique, and investigate everything at their disposal so as to become the best teacher that they can possibly be. It's such a privilege to work with incoming cohorts of teacher candidates, all eager to pursue their own professional identity, not only as teacher, but as educator. This is what drives me in my work in teacher education, especially Indigenous education with my teacher candidates. So pictured here is one of my cohorts of teacher candidates in Vancouver, BC at our Musqueam campus. Every autumn we would take a decolonize the campus walk together where we would look at sites of deconstructing settler colonialism and settler normativity as is manifested in the physical landscape of the campus. And so this picture here is the reconciliation pole at UBC. And it was part of my morning commute every day when I would walk to our Faculty of Education building. But each time I would go with a cohort of teacher candidates to this site. Together we would discover something new. Of course, however, though, Indigenous education isn't always feel goods and so peachy. There are many tears that are shed. Together, we share the pain of hearing testimonies of residential school survivors, or we face the challenges of interrupting our own Eurocentric schooling experiences. We grapple with resistance, racisms, rejecting what we refuse to accept about the educational systems we inherit. But amidst the challenges that my settler and Indigenous teacher candidates grapple with, it is also a site of possibility for reconciliation and meaningful change. All this is to say, teacher education is uniquely positioned as a critical site for a praxis of reconciliation to transpire. In a praxis of reconciliation, our teacher candidates are invited to move from learning about reconciliation to learning through reconciliation, and likewise, ultimately, teaching through reconciliation. So I understand a praxis of reconciliation as the embodiment of reconciliation as a curricular and pedagogical praxis. So to say this differently, I understand reconciliation to be something to be lived, something that has tangible implications on the lives of Indigenous and settler peoples. I see it as a direct call to action in education to see the educative value that reconciliatory pedagogies can have in our teaching and learning. In a praxis of reconciliation, I see two concepts working in flux, one against the other, in conversation with each other. These two concepts being the possibilities of reconciliation and the other being the challenges to reconciliation. So I'll speak to those here. Here I identify the challenges to reconciliation as that which limits or hinders a praxis of reconciliation in teacher education. So one of these challenges here being the prior knowledge or lacking prior knowledge. So this praxis of reconciliation is challenged by the realities of teacher candidates coming into their teacher education programs without having had many authentic learning opportunities about Indigenous peoples, and at times some of whom haven't even met an Indigenous person before. Of course, this definitely isn't the experience of all teacher candidates, but even those who have had many opportunities to think about Indigenous identity or they are Indigenous themselves, we still have to start with educating their peers about the reality. So inevitably, we start at square one together. In teacher education, we're not only attempting to teach something new about Indigenous peoples, but any attempt at employing a praxis of reconciliation is also often working against unpacking stereotypes, misconceptions, and assumptions held about Indigenous peoples. It's the lack of relevant experience, however, that teacher candidates often come to mandatory Indigenous education courses then eager to learn because they felt as though they did not have these opportunities in their previous schooling. Another challenge to a praxis of reconciliation is the evidence of practicing this, what I call active distancing. So we see this active constructing of identities and positions that distances oneself from Indigenous peoples, issues, and the responsibility to reconciliation. So for example, we see this discourse in educators who don't see themselves as, history teachers. Oh, I teach math or I teach science, I don't teach history, right? And so kind of conflating all of the limitless possibilities of Indigenous education with something of a historical artifact. I also see this with students with teacher candidates or likewise teachers who also don't envision themselves as having too many Indigenous students in their classroom. So therefore, if I'm not going to teach Indigenous students, why do I need to have Indigenous education? This perceived irrelevance of Indigenous education then equates to not having a sense of responsibility to reconciliation. The interrogation of active distancing is much more than demanding or addressing, this lack of prior knowledge, but it first requires a deconstruction of personal and professional identity to envision oneself as being implicit in reconciliation and decolonization. And lastly, for this pedagogies of settler normativity, it's something I very much saw come out of my research in Ontario and New Zealand when I was looking at our teacher education programs, where the majority of our teacher candidate programs were still made up predominantly of white female teacher candidates. In such cases, then, Indigenous education was a startling contrast to one's epistemologies, but it also provoked one's sense of whiteness and or settler identity. Whereas Indigenous teacher education not only concerns Indigenous content, so, studying Indigenous cultures or studying Indigenous histories, but Indigenous educators are also asking teacher candidates to unpack notions of one's racialized and ancestral identity and inherent privileges. Interrogating the prevalence of settler normativity often begins with the provocation, what does it mean to be a Canadian teacher? So So now moving towards the possibilities of reconciliation. I understand the possibilities of reconciliation of anything which encourages this praxis of reconciliation to be manifested. So once again, moving towards this idea of how can it be embodied? It's not just a buzzword. It's not something we just talk about. What does it mean to live through reconciliation or teach through reconciliation? So the first here being those moments of learning, or perhaps more important, of unlearning. So moments of unlearning happened. It was a very iterative process through coursework and through practical teaching placements. For many, this was in relation to privileges, settler identity, and really kind of interrogating this idea of what do I know or what do I think I know about Indigenous peoples. So again, it's the unpacking before we can begin to move forward in an ethical way. So many of my teacher candidates are eager to jump in and ask for resources and ask for lesson plans because they just want to get right into the nitty-gritty of Indigenous education. But before we do this, we need to have those moments for unlearning. Otherwise, we're at risk of perpetuating the same settler colonial discourse that has silenced and infantilized Indigenous knowledge systems in our curriculum. Furthermore, for so many of my teacher candidates, their process of reconciliation began with this moment or moments of acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of identity, acknowledgements of privilege, acknowledgements of histories, and this goes hand in hand with of responsibility. So this gradual recognizing of responsibilities is one of the richest experiences I get to share with my teacher candidates because it's in these moments that they feel empowered. The intent of Indigenous education is never to make students or any learner feel guilt or shame for the past, especially for the actions of ancestors, for example, but quite the opposite. To ground ourselves in a foundation of truth and to see a way forward together. So, what does this all mean for the future of reconciliation in teacher education? I see teacher education as a rich site of possibility for a praxis of reconciliation. The experiences of our teacher candidates that they have in their initial teacher education programs shape their professional identity for a lifetime as Canadian teachers or educators more broadly, whether they stay here or whether they teach abroad. When they see themselves as educators of Indigenous education, they can begin to play a fundamental role in reconciliatory processes in the present and the future, and that's where the true power lies. For teacher educators, mentors, advisors with us here this afternoon, I encourage you to pursue authentic engagement with diverse Indigenous knowledge as much as possible. Provide those opportunities, provide those conversations. Whose voices are being represented in the readings you assign or the resources you teach from? Are there opportunities for our students to disrupt settler colonialism and assumptions held about Indigenous peoples? We don't need to have all the answers before we engage in conversation. For teacher candidates, I encourage you to seek diverse Indigenous resources across all classrooms, all subject areas that you teach from. Even if it isn't a lesson that is premised around Indigenous peoples, I invite you to think about what might Indigenous perspectives in this look like. I've seen fabulous units constructed by teacher candidates around Indigenous knowledges and perspectives of earthquakes and volcanoes, principles of patterning and mathematical reasoning, maple syrup tapping, mixing of paint pigments, and the list goes on. If you've been waiting for an invitation to engage with Indigenous perspectives in the classroom, this is it, if you haven't had it already. As our lives continue to be shaped around what is most essential, ask yourself, where are Indigenous knowledges in this conversation? What knowledges and perspectives are needed for future generations to be proud of the world that they inherit, so as to live softly on this land? there's my contact info to hopefully keep this conversation going. That is everything formal that I've had and wanted to leave plenty of time for hopefully some rich discussion this afternoon.
Awesome. Thanks for that amazing presentation, Kira. We do have a couple of questions that were in the Q&A. Also, it's not too late to put those questions in the Q&A. So if you do have anything you'd like to say, comments or questions, please put them in there and we will get to them. So the first question we have is, what is your opinion on non-Indigenous researchers using métissage as a research methodology in social sciences research?
Definitely. Thank you. And thank you for the beautiful question. I'm a big fan of métissage, obviously through my own work, but I'm constantly inspired by the work of Indigenous and settler researchers using the possibilities of métissage. So for those that perhaps are kind of new to métissage, as I understand it, it's really informed by Cynthia Chambers, Dwayne Donald, a variety of Indigenous and settler scholars who it's a pedagogical but also a narrative discourse to think about one's own lived experiences in terms of, writing autobiography, writing one's own narrative, and then kind of juxtaposing this with Indigenous settler stories to create and kind of complicate this rich conversation. My experiences alone, it's not the only experience, particularly for settler people living on Indigenous land. Your experience and your relationship with land is valued and valuable and needs to be part of the conversation, but it also can't supersede Indigenous relationship to place. And so allowing kind of this breadth and this intersection of conversation to come together, that's what I think is really, really rich about métissage, because it opens up that complexity, that diversity we experience, leaning into the tension, right? How does my experience being in this place, how is that different from yours? And using that as a jumping off point for then rich conversation and really embracing kind of that tension. So it kind of comes from literally this braiding of experience. So to answer the question, I think it's incredibly powerful for settler researchers to use this. Not only researchers, but I think even researchers more broadly. I think that all by trade as teachers, we naturally are researchers. We investigate into our practice. We ask those hard questions. It's a great way to keep ourselves accountable as well, and to criticize the resources we're using, the conversations we're engaging in, and where does Indigenous perspective help to bring richness and diversity and tension to the conversations that we're trying to have. So I think using métissage both for settler and for non-Indigenous peoples, for settler and for Indigenous peoples, is a really rich jumping off point to think about the work that we do as researchers and as educators.
Wonderful. That's a great answer. Thank you, Kira. Another question that has come up is, firstly, thanking you for the talk. And it seems the language of reconciliation avoids the issues of governance. And perhaps this is why it seems as though it is conceptually easier for settlers to adopt a reconciliatory stance rather than support lands and governance rights. I don't know if I was teaching in a First Nation school if I would want to teach about reconciliation. I would want to teach about self-determination and self-governance. Where is self-determination and self-governance recognized in the language of reconciliation?
Oh, I love it. I love it, love it. Especially getting at the heart of absolutely understanding context, right? If you are teaching primarily with Indigenous students, this should and will look very different in terms of whether it be the language of reconciliation, self-determination. I see the two as being hand in hand, but fulfilling two different responsibilities. I believe that when we are carrying ourselves in a way that is reconciliatory, that is focused on moving towards justice, that in turn has to uphold Indigenous right for self-determination. And I envision self-determination absolutely being at the crux of self-governance and having political implications in terms of self-determination, but I think self-determination can also be thought of in terms of self-representation. So I encourage my students, my teacher candidates, and the practicing teachers that I work with to think about self-determination also as being an act of supporting Indigenous language revitalization, of supporting and prioritizing Indigenous voice when we're having conversations about Indigenous perspectives. It's that act of self-representation being an enactment and moving towards self-determination. So I think that I perhaps would frame what I do in terms of critical, decolonizing, reconciliatory work ultimately really is an embodiment towards self-determination. But I don't really, I think, frame all those conversations as a practice of self-determination, because what self-determination looks like to me is very different than even, say, my husband, who is a settler, immigrant, educator. The way in which he enacts self-determination would be quite different to support Indigenous self-determination. And it is the embodiment of reconciliation that brings those conversations together. So that's why I still often kind of frame that conversation in terms of reconciliatory pedagogies first. But I don't think that we need to, that's just my own practice. I'm not suggesting that we need to prioritize and use the language of reconciliation. Absolutely, it's contentious. That's how I lead my own work. But we absolutely need to be prefacing. I would confidently say that even if we don't use the language of reconciliation, self-determination certainly has to be on the table.
Thank you for that answer there, Kira. Another question, well, we're going to group a couple questions into one here. And essentially, for teacher candidates who want to support reconciliation but are afraid of making mistakes or don't know where to start, what would your advice be? And how would you work on incorporating different Indigenous perspectives into the classroom? What are your suggestions for those steps?
For sure. I mean, there's definitely no one size fits all, but my go-to of if this is something that's quite new, I am a huge proponent of using children's literature, of Indigenous children's literature, authored by Indigenous peoples. Using Indigenous children's literature, whether it's children's for our young ones or moving up to young adult, graphic novels and fiction, nonfiction, what have you. When we use literatures that are authored by Indigenous peoples, we then get to have that Indigenous voice front and center. Once again, it's enacting self-determination and self-representation by having that autonomy, by having that agency. As Indigenous peoples, we don't need to be given a voice. We have a voice, and we have used that medium of ancestral stories, talking with Indigenous peoples. But when we don't have those relationships with Indigenous peoples to be able to seek that Indigenous voice and that ancestral knowledge, I find that that's where the possibility of using Indigenous literatures is a very accessible way to bring it in. You have Indigenous voice, you use the literatures in your classroom, you can investigate and study by using and continuously coming back to that text itself, but it also has then that jumping off point for meeting you wherever you're at, wherever your students are at, but it continues to ground that Indigenous voice through literature in the classroom. So that would be kind of my first go-to step.
Wonderful. The next question is, I had someone say that a non-Indigenous teacher will use the excuse of not wanting to offend or teach the culture wrong as a means of misinformation. We can have invitees, but only so many are available at a time. And with COVID, it's harder to have guest speakers, especially in the early years. Thoughts?
Definitely. I think that prefacing the conversation, or at least using the excuse of I either don't know enough or I'm going to do more damage than good, I think that however well-intentioned it is, that's why we're feeling so far behind in Indigenous education. Indigenous education is nothing new. It's been part of a conversation so long as we've had Canadian education and Canadian schooling. And I think, however well-intentioned the sentiment is, it just continues to kind of pass the buck and pass the responsibility to someone else who often is an Indigenous person. So when I get requests, again, from well-intended teachers who haven't taught about Indigenous education for the rest of the year because they're really kind of anxious about it, and then they just want me to come in and give a guest presentation for 40 minutes and kind of cover everything that needs to be done. Sure, it's acknowledging Indigenous voice and autonomy, but then at the same time, it's an appropriation of Indigenous energies, really, of doing your own homework, putting the time and energy and effort into finding what a genuine practice looks like in Indigenous education in your own practice, even if it's kind of muddled, even if it's kind of strained, taking those steps and working your way towards, you can only do what you can do this year. Maybe you focus on one unit that you're really going to incorporate Indigenous perspectives into. Maybe that's feasible right now. And then moving forward, you can start to incorporate in a much more authentic way more Indigenous perspectives. But if the excuse is consistently, it's not my place, I don't know enough, or I'm going to do more damage than good, then ask yourself, whose responsibility is that? Because it can't be on the shoulders of Indigenous people to educate all Canadians in this work.
Great. Another one, pardon me on my pronunciation, Sheikh Han Kira Nyawen, for your presentation. You presented Kashwenta as a treaty of our territory, as a reflection of a nation-to-nation accord. I'm wondering how you'd situate a reconciliatory understanding to Kashwenta. As Richard Venables wrote on the Dutch understandings of this treaty, respect seemed well situated in this treaty from both sides.
Beautiful. Thank you, Mike. And sega sewakwego to whoever's out there of some of the Mohawk language, Nyawa, for your question. Sorry, Mike, could I have you go back the second half of the question? I think I missed something. So it's focusing on Guswenta, or the two-row treaty. Would you mind reading out that quote again?
So I'm wondering how you would situate a reconciliatory understanding to Kashwenta. As Richard Venables wrote on the Dutch understandings of this treaty, respect seemed well situated in the treaty from both sides.
Beautiful, definitely. I mean, there's a few different frameworks. What I really wanted to preface, or at least kind of couch this conversation of reconciliation, as I understand Guswenta, is to honor that it's a shared path. There's a mutual responsibility to one another, but that these roles are going to look differently. And when we start to kind of steer each other's canoe, or take responsibility for something that isn't ours to take, or likewise to appropriate something that isn't ours to appropriate, that's when we then start to, I think, lose sight of reconciliation in terms of compromising self-determination and Indigenous ability to self-govern, to self-determine. So as I understand Guswenta, when it was originally signed with the Dutch, my ancestors, or our ancestors, saw Mohawk people as being self-governing people. We have our own historical, one of the best democracies in the world. It works for us and we know what we're doing. We can educate our children, we can raise them in the language, and likewise, we also aren't going to tell you how to steer or try to steer your canoe or your ship. But we very much saw through settler colonialism that no longer was going to be on the table, in that my ancestors' ability to be able to raise us in our language with our families and with a strong sense of Mohawk identity was ripped from us through colonization, residential schools, and the forcible removal of Indigenous peoples from our land. And so really that was we saw Guswenta being dissolved in those acts, and in the harm that has been done as well. So I think that by returning to Guswenta, it really is an opportunity to think about self-determination, but importantly, being in the same path together. So it's not that you do your thing, I'll do my thing. There is that room for conversation. It's that reconciliatory pedagogy that can bind us together and hold us in conversation. And as I mentioned earlier, also thinking about what does it mean to live righteously, to live justly. We are united because we live on this land and it's a shared land together. So if I kind of turned a blind eye to settler identity of, no, I'm going to do my own thing, it really then is losing sight of who do I also share and occupy this land with? And that's what unites us, if nothing else.
Thank you, Kira. The next question comes from Victoria. Miigwech, as a survivor of residential school and first-year principal back in my community, I had to work hard once again to reconcile with my own people. What are your suggestions to go into the slow and share my own journey in the Western academics?
Thank you so very much. What an incredible accomplishment. I share that warmth. My family, I also come from a long history of educators, going back to my great-great-grandfather who built this cabin. He was also a principal and a teacher in a time that we had our Indian day schools here, and the Indian agent would come and would make note that he had to be teaching in English, couldn't teach the Mohawk language. And as soon as that door shut, he began to still teach the Mohawk language, despite it being a criminal act. So thank you. And what beautiful words of encouragement that you are where you are. It makes me quite emotional. So to think about words of advice of kind of walking in, I think being in education, having to tread the waters of still operating within settler colonialism day to day, decolonizing myself. A few words of advice. My biggest thing, I think, is to never lose sight of connection to land, and that when nothing else makes sense, that the land makes sense, and that the land brings me back to who I am. I think another thing, and actually what I'll be speaking to about tonight a little bit, I won't be speaking about kind of this two worlds discourse, but I will be speaking about the fluidity and adaptation that our ancestors have always had to change. So if you're interested in that, that's what I'll be speaking about tonight. But I mention this because sometimes I hear as though Indigenous peoples who work in academia or who work in education, that we walk in two worlds. And I'm not sure that resonates with me, to be honest. I don't feel like I walk in two worlds. I walk in this world as a contemporary Haudenosaunee woman. And my identity is a combination of, it is informed by colonization, it is informed by settler colonialism, but I also have a responsibility to then move forward in this work amidst all these tensions. We've never been, a static people. There's never been a more, kind of authentic or pure kind of indigeneity. And now somehow I'm removed from that, and therefore I walk in two worlds. It is just my world. It's the Kira Brandt world. And likewise, my Haudenosaunee brothers and sisters, we also are contemporary Indigenous people walking amidst all of this. So anyways, I share this just to say that all the facets of who you are and all the tension and the hard work that we do have to face being Indigenous peoples working in primarily a non-Indigenous context, it will be troublesome and there are difficult conversations to be had, but there's nothing for you to have to reconcile. You carry on your good work in a good way, and make those negotiations as they have to happen, but to not lose sight of who you are in this time and to ground yourself in land.
Thank you, Kira. And just one final question here is to wrap things up. As an act of reconciliation, I had the opportunity to live on a Northern Reserve for a week to meet and enter into relationship with First Nations people. I found it a wonderful opportunity to learn in a real context. Are you aware of any opportunities like this for settlers and or settler students to initiate and deepen their understanding and connection to Indigenous people?
There are some opportunities, to be honest, that do come to mind of nonprofit organizations that help connect teachers to remote or rural First Nations communities who are in need of First Nations educators. They're not without their own challenges, however, because sometimes we get young teachers who go into these communities, get a year or two of experience, and then leave. And then we kind of have this, we don't have that retention or continuity for our students. So that constant rotation and kind of parachuting into an Indigenous community is troublesome. So I guess I would say seek opportunities to build relationship with either local Indigenous communities, or if you do see yourself kind of going somewhere more remote, make sure that those relationships are happening gradually if possible before you kind of go and seek that out. Follow them on Facebook. I know that my very small community here is very active on Facebook of sharing, different job opportunities, sharing what our community response is to COVID-19. And you can really kind of start to put your finger on the pulse, and you never know those connections that you're going to make. But I think that my one word of advice would be to make those relationships meaningful, sustainable, and gradual, and then seek those opportunities, because there really isn't kind of this one centralized place where you can go to find those opportunities, because the best opportunities are going to come to those where you've put that time into that relationship right from the get-go.
And just as a final wrap up, Kira, thank you so much for your knowledge and spending your time to share your knowledge with us on this important issue. To the attendees, thank you for being present and asking your valuable questions. I hope everybody has a great afternoon.